Why reality hasn't moved yet. Hear that as a question about timing, not as a verdict. If you feel stalled, if the world outside hasn't yet matched the quietness you're cultivating inside, that stillness is often the beginning of the translation, the first signal that the system is preparing to shift. Reality tends to wait until your inner field becomes legible. That is the paradox at the heart of this title. What looks like inactivity can be the most honest sign that something important is happening beneath the surface. Think of the moment just before dawn, when the air stops churning and the horizon holds its breath. In the same way, when your life seems unmoved, your nervous system may be pausing long enough to rewrite its baseline. The reason reality hasn't moved yet is rarely because the universe is withholding. More often, it's because your internal signals are still noisy, contradictory, or simply too loud. Manifestation is not a loud demand. It's a readable signature. When your internal world settles, the external world can finally respond to a clearer request. So what does this quiet beginning feel like? It's not dramatic. It's a subtle unwinding. You may notice your chest loosening a fraction. Your breath becomes a little fuller without effort. Thought loops that used to run on repeat take longer to start. Those small shifts matter because they indicate a drop in internal interference, the exact thing that makes your intentions legible to the field that responds to coherence. Reality hasn't moved yet because until these whisper-level changes multiply, the signal you're sending looks like static. We often mistake stillness for stagnation. We were trained to equate effort and noise with progress, louder strategies, harder pushing, bigger lists. But the mechanics of alignment are not volume-based. There's a difference between trying harder and aligning more clearly. Intensity can create more internal friction. It raises cortisol, tightens the chest, and keeps the mind scanning for problems. That increased internal tension produces noisy signals. The reason reality hasn't moved yet is often that you are still broadcasting mixed instructions, wanting one thing while resisting it with fear, or asking without embodying the softer identity already living in that reality. A science-informed lens here without replacing the tenderness of experience. Neuroscience speaks cautiously about patterns that relate to this process. When the nervous system shifts from hypervigilance to a calmer baseline, there tends to be a reduction in repetitive automatic thought patterns, what some researchers describe as decreased neural noise. That reduction in mental static correlates with better regulation and clear decision-making. So when you notice small physiological changes, easier breathing, less reactivity, the same situation drawing a softer response, those are early markers. The reason reality hasn't moved yet often lies in the fact that these neural openings are still shallow. They need time and small, repeated inputs to deepen into a new set point. It's helpful to borrow a metaphor from physics as a poetic frame, not as literal proof. Imagine possibility as a wave, broad and full of potential. For something specific to appear, that wave needs to settle into a more focused form. In popular language, this is sometimes called collapse, and used carefully as an image, it can clarify what's required: reduced interference and a coherent internal signal. When your internal world is cluttered with doubt, fear, second-guessing, or frantic effort, that wave keeps sloshing and never finds the shape it intends. The reason reality hasn't moved yet is that the wave of your intention hasn't been allowed to calm enough to take form. Because the shift is quiet, we need simple, reliable indicators to know it's happening. Start with the breath. If your breath lengthens on its own, not because you forced it, but because attention has eased, that is a meaningful signal. The chest softening, the shoulders dropping an inch, an absence of the pull between your eyebrows, these are bodily fingerprints of a system releasing its old anchor. Another indicator is the tempo of thought. Instead of automatic loops that replay past fears, you find yourself able to hold an intention without immediate commentary. That pause, even if it's only a second, is a doorway. The reason reality hasn't moved yet is often that most people never notice these minute openings. They are there, but overlooked. Also, watch your reactivity. When circumstances that once triggered panic now pass with a neutral curiosity, that's coherence at work. You don't need the outer world to change for this to show up. Your nervous system can become more precise even within the same conditions. This refinement, however subtle, matters because the field that responds to you is tracking the pattern, not the story. It doesn't read the narrative of want as well as it reads the embodied signal. The reason reality hasn't moved yet is that until your embodied pattern aligns with your intention, opportunities struggle to match your inner state. You may ask, how do small shifts turn into larger changes? It is a compound effect. Micro-adjustments accumulate in a way that's almost mathematical. Repeated moments of reduced reactivity change your baseline. When your baseline shifts, you stop filtering new possibilities through old worry. New behavior becomes easier because it feels congruent with who you now are. Opportunities that previously passed by with resonance begin to register as natural fits. That's the moment when external reality starts to catch up. The reason reality hasn't moved yet is tied to how long it takes for enough micro-changes to reorient your system into a new attractor state. There's a practical side to this that doesn't ask you to manufacture feelings. The first practice is noticing. Pause briefly, place a hand on your chest if you like, and ask, what is different right now? Is my breath shallower or deeper? Am I scanning for threats, or can I hold this moment with a neutral tone? These are not rituals, they are empirical checks. When you label internal changes, you make them visible to yourself. The reason reality hasn't moved yet is that most of us don't attend to these markers. We expect fireworks rather than a soft temperature change. Another simple practice is a single micro-gesture to anchor the shift. It could be touching the thumb and forefinger together, or setting a tiny intention phrase mentally like, "This feels true," when you notice the chest ease. This is not magical symbolism, it's behavioral conditioning. Each time you pair the softening with the gesture or phrase, you help the nervous system remember that state. Over days and weeks, this associative process deepens the opening. The reason reality hasn't moved yet, for many, is that the system has not had enough repeated, consistent inputs to prefer the new pattern over the old one. We need to name a common sabotage, the addiction to intensity. There is cultural praise for heroic hustle, visible evidence, big bursts, urgent emails, relentless action. Intensity feels productive because it gives immediate, measurable output. But intensity often increases internal noise. It stimulates the fight or flight circuits and tightens the muscles that must later relax for coherency to emerge. If you keep turning up the volume on your efforts while expecting subtle internal shifts, you create a mismatch. The reason reality hasn't moved yet is that louder output can drown the delicate signal you're trying to send. Another common error is scanning for external proof too early. You might begin to measure success by an obvious sign, a call, a bank deposit, a new job, and miss the fact that everything is rearranging on a softer level. Scanning keeps you in the same loop because it engages the survival circuitry and prolongs the very reactivity you are trying to reduce. The reason reality hasn't moved yet is frequently about timing. The system needs quiet to settle before visible evidence appears. If you continue to demand proof before you can trust the quiet, you delay the translation. There's an emotional component that deserves soft attention. When these quiet shifts begin, you may feel vulnerable or unsure. Old anxieties can flare because the familiar chaos had its own predictability. This paradox is normal. Change doesn't always feel safe at first. So part of the work is befriending a new kind of uncertainty, a quieter, less urgent curiosity. The reason reality hasn't moved yet is sometimes that the emotional system needs permission to tolerate a different tempo. Give it small, repeated experiences of safety inside this new rhythm, and it will gradually accept the change. Practical scaffolding helps.
Begin each day with 2 minutes of noticing. Check breath depth, count one cycle of thought that now pauses rather than chases, and mark one small softening. Throughout the day, when you catch yourself reacting, name it gently. Ah, there's the old pattern. This simple act of naming interrupts the loop without needing to fix it. Over time, these interruptions reduce the frequency of the loops, allowing coherence to increase. The reason reality hasn't moved yet is that coherence is a habit-building process. It needs repetition more than intensity. A short story might make this clearer. Imagine someone you know, not a miraculous figure, but ordinary, who has been chasing a career move for years. They switched resume versions, networked harder, finished courses. Nothing changed. Then one morning, they stopped trying to force a specific outcome and instead began practicing quiet attunement, shorter reaction windows, pausing before answering emails, noticing breath during anxiety spikes, and accepting invitations without overinterpreting them. Over months, their baseline changed. They were calmer, clearer, and less desperate. Opportunities then arrived that matched that quieter energy, not because they had worked harder, but because their internal signal had become readable. The reason reality hadn't moved yet for them was that their system had been broadcasting urgency. Once that eased, the world could respond differently. This leads to another essential point. Clarity beats control. When you try to micromanage how things should show up, you run the risk of creating brittle expectations that snap at the first unexpected twist. Clarity of intention, paired with flexible embodiment, yields better results. Set a firm intention for what you want, but cultivate a body and nervous system that can hold it with rigid attachment. The reason reality hasn't moved yet is often the presence of controlling tension. Loosen the grip, and the path for translation clears. Now, a short note on the language of quantum. It can be a useful metaphor for the translation from possibility to reality when used carefully. Think of it as an analogy. A wave of potential becomes something specific when interference falls away. This image helps to conceptualize why inner coherence is necessary. But do not mistake the metaphor for a laboratory proof. Physics and personal change operate in different domains. The reason reality hasn't moved yet is not a failed experiment in physics. It's a relational dynamic between your embodied state and the environment that perceives it. What might slow the process further are unresolved internal contradictions, beliefs or behaviors that point in opposite directions. You might affirm abundance and simultaneously carry deep fear about scarcity. These opposing currents create interference. Imagine trying to tune a radio while two stations play simultaneously. The result is static.
The reason reality hasn't moved yet is that until the opposing frequencies find resolution, or at least become quieter, the dial can't land on a clean station. So, how do you reduce interference? 2 practical steps. 1. Bring curiosity to the contradiction, rather than shame. When you notice opposing beliefs, ask with compassion where the fear comes from and what it once protected you from. 2. Create small embodied experiments that align with the new belief. If you want to be seen as creative, allow yourself a tiny public creative act, not as proof of worth, but as data for your nervous system. Repeating tiny aligned behaviors rewires expectation. The reason reality hasn't moved yet is that the internal architecture of habit needs new inputs to prefer a different outcome. Another sign that coherence is deepening, your impulse to force resolves into a willingness to steward. At first, you might feel compelled to arrange every external detail. Later, you move into care, tending what you can and letting the rest unfold. Stewardship is a calmer posture. It maintains presence without frantic correction. The reason reality hasn't moved yet is that until you can adopt stewardship rather than coercion, the external world will resist tight manipulation and unpredictable friction will persist. Let's pause for a practical check-in. If any of this resonates, if you sense a small quietness already, acknowledge it. You don't need a ceremony. If you feel safe doing so, type "I trust the quiet shift" in the comments below as a small optional recognition of the moment. It's a simple social acknowledgement. Nothing required, but it can help you and others notice the opening. The reason reality hasn't moved yet will begin to feel less like failure and more like preparation when we learn to mark these first signals. There are also everyday habits that either support or sabotage this quiet work. Sleep, movement, and gentle routines matter because they set the physiological stage for coherence. Poor sleep perpetuates hypervigilance. Consistent, gentle movement helps the nervous system integrate small releases of stress. None of this guarantees external changes, but these supports increase the likelihood that the internal system will generate clearer signals. The reason reality hasn't moved yet is often found in neglected basics. Tending them gives the quiet shift fuel to consolidate. Another layer involves language and identity. The stories you tell about yourself shape the background music of your system. If your identity keeps defaulting to not enough or always lacking, your body will align with that narrative. To change this, practice gentle reframing. Notice a self-limiting line and offer a modest alternative that feels believable. Instead of declaring "I'm going to be wealthy," which might trigger resistance, try "I'm learning to move with a different standard of allowance."
This kind of incremental identity work helps your system accept the new possibility without needing to leap into an implausible story. The reason reality hasn't moved yet is that identity-level shifts take time. They require micro-translations, not declarations. Let's be clear about pacing. The quiet shift is seldom instantaneous. Expect days of oscillation, where you feel calm in the morning and tense in the afternoon. That is part of the normal settling process. What changes is the overall trend. More calm days than frantic ones over time. Keep your measures gentle and process-oriented. The reason reality hasn't moved yet is rarely a single failure. It's a timeline that includes plateaus and a slow cumulative turn. When we speak of compound effects, remember that the environment also responds to the new baseline. People sense your steadier presence and may offer different opportunities. Conversations change tone. You begin attracting invitations that align with the quieter signal you are now giving off. This isn't magic. It's social and systemic resonance. Your clearer internal state interacts with other systems more effectively. The reason reality hasn't moved yet is that until you become that clearer presence consistently, social and situational cues will largely reflect your prior pattern. If you want a little more structure to support this process, there are resources that can help you practice without pressure. For example, the Awaken Your Quantum Power ebook and its companion materials are designed as an optional toolkit, practical exercises, short guided practices, and gentle frameworks to help you notice and stabilize whisper-level shifts. They are offered as support, not as a promise. Use them if you find the format helpful. You are always the final arbiter of what resonates. The reason reality hasn't moved yet is not a defect in you. It's an invitation to a new practice, one that can be assisted by steady guidance. As we move towards synthesis, hold this central answer to the title lightly. Reality hasn't moved yet because your system is still emitting mixed, noisy signals that make it hard for the field to interpret your intention. Calmness is not lack. It's the refining of your frequency until it becomes a clear request. The job is not to manufacture certainty, but to cultivate coherency. The quieter, more consistent, and more embodied your signal becomes, the more likely external conditions are to reorganize in ways that match it. What concrete choices can you take from here? First, notice daily. 2 minutes in the morning, one micro gesture to anchor a moment of softening, and a brief check-in when you catch yourself reacting. Second, reduce intensity where it's habit-driven. Practice doing less with more alignment rather than more with frantic energy. Third, allow curiosity to investigate contradictions rather than punishing them. These steps are small but cumulative.
The reason reality hasn't moved yet is that systems change through addition of many small, consistent elements, not through one grand, desperate act. Finally, give yourself time and permission to be patient with a kind of trust that is quiet rather than loud. Trust doesn't require certainty. It asks for willing attention and repeated nurturing. When you learn to notice the breath, mark the chest softening, and choose one microgesture to anchor your new baseline, you are giving your nervous system the signals it needs to prefer a different state. Over weeks and months, these choices create a new attractor, a pattern the world can read. At that point, external shifts are no longer surprises, but plausible outcomes of your internal coherence. Reality hasn't moved yet, not because you are failing, but because translation takes a gentler, steadier rhythm than drive allows. The invitation is to slow down enough to be legible. If you'd like optional support to practice this reliably, the Awaken Your Quantum Power ebook and companion provide structured, short practices and reminders to help anchor the quiet shift. They are tools to assist mindfulness and embodied habit change, not shortcuts or guarantees. If that feels like something you'd use, you can find the link in the pinned comment. Remember, the first signs of movement are soft. They are breath that deepens without forcing, a thought that pauses before it spirals, an old reaction that softens into curiosity. When you learn to recognize and reinforce these small openings, reality begins to follow. Why reality hasn't moved yet becomes not a complaint, but a map, a guide to attention, coherence, and the patient unfolding of an inward state into outward form. Trust the quiet process, tend it gently, and allow the world to meet you in that new, readable frequency.